There are several different models of measuring social value. Social return on investment is broadly seen as the gold standard of measuring social value because it is able to place a cashable amount, a monetary amount, on the outcomes that you might identify. We looked at about 50 charities and social enterprises to see whether they were using these models, and also if they weren't, how well they were measuring their social value. We looked at whether organisations were measuring outputs. So by that we mean we have delivered 3,000 hours of training. That would be an output rather than outcome, because you're not looking at the result of that, you're looking at exactly what you did. We looked to see if these organisations were measuring wider impacts, which is where the spillover question comes in. Are they looking at things beyond and outside of their direct remit? So this can be everything from sort of employment impacts and wider health benefits or productivity through to environmental type impacts. We also looked to see whether stakeholder participation was part of this. We then looked at the distance travelled question. So this is around, if an organisation measures its social value, it obviously has to get a sense of progress and a sense of how well is it doing. And then finally, we looked to see how many organisations were trying to attribute or put financial monetary value onto the outcomes they were achieving. And overall, what we found is that there was no single group of providers or of organisations that were particularly adept at measuring or communicating their social value. What we found is that a lot of organisations were conflating the difference between an output and an outcome. Our second sort of stumbling block that we found was that a lot of the organisations we looked at tended to try and measure the social value for a particular programme or a particular project, rather than across the entire organisation, rather than across everything they were doing. The other thing we found was that organisations that helped vulnerable groups tended to be better at recording the impact of their activities and tended to be better at measuring the value of that than some of the more campaigning or educating organisations. Our fourth point, which is kind of, I suppose, most relevant for today, is that very few organisations considered the spillover impacts. The final point is that reporting and communicating are not the same thing, or measuring and communicating are not the same thing. And I think that's quite important too when we think about choosing between or looking at the relative value of different organisations providing a service. Some of them may just not be very good at articulating what they do or communicating it, despite the fact they may still be measuring it in-house. There's a spectrum of performance from inputs, which is we spent X thousand pounds, to output, we delivered X thousand leaflets, to outcomes, these leaflets led to increased employment from this particular group. And it's actually the ease of measurement reduces as you go down that sort of spectrum. It's easy to look at how much money you spent. It's easy to look at how many leaflets how many people came to your services. It's the tricky bit is the measurement of the outcome. And I think when we talk about spillover can only be seen in outcomes, because spillover is the unintended result of other things, of your inputs and outputs. They're the sort of other good stuff that happens. Whilst you might be able to identify spillover, being able to measure that spillover is a whole other matter, because there are not necessarily the equivalent outcome measurements in housing and criminal justice and education and employment. I mean, you might talk about productivity, but there are none in those other sectors that are as sophisticated as the ones you might find in health. Also, there's almost sort of a spillover within health. The NHS Social Value Project that was piloted in 2009, 2010 in 8 primary care trusts tried to look at social value within the health framework they were looking at, and they identified clinical outcomes, plus all these other things. They were looking at patient advocacy and, quality of care, respect for patients, all these other things. Actually, just within a kind of health framework, you can pull out all this other good stuff over and above care, over and above clinical outcomes. Where does this leave SROI? Because if we think about few organisations actually mastering outcomes measurement, that's a far cry from the rigours and the thoroughness of a return on investment model. Are we asking people to do something which is actually so far beyond their scale of delivery that it's actually sort of non-efficient, if you like? What I would say is that while that might be the case, social return on investment type models are a great discipline Because the first step of any of these types of models is you have to identify your outcomes and you have to identify your mission statement. You'd be surprised how many organisations are at the front line of public services just have kind of lost that sense of ultimate aim and have sort of boiled and narrowed themselves down to essentially our aim is to fulfil this contract. You have to think about SROI as a sort of an aspiration, but not sort of the sort of end goal in and of itself, and the interim steps towards more rigorous social return on investment type models are just as valuable. That links to proportionality. Smaller organisations have to have a lighter touch and have to have a lighter burden of evaluation than larger ones. The kind of other two priorities I think for social value measurement is comparability and standardisation. That we actually need to have it's vital for providers in order to benchmark themselves against others, but it's also vital for commissioners, because there is no way you can make a well-informed commissioning decision if providers all aren't on the same page in terms of measuring and articulating their impact. And part of that, a tool towards that comparability, is the standardisation of measurement tools. So if you can encourage the take-up of off-the-peg tools that enable providers to articulate outcomes and measure outcomes in an accessible way that, you know, isn't too much work for the little ones, but the bigger ones can maybe use it more ambitiously, then you're kind of halfway there to getting decent commissioning decisions, because you enable everyone to be on the same page and using the same measures.